It's Dr. Tennant's Verbal Highs. Let's start the show with Lewis Tennant. Here we go. Guests and interviews that you're looking for with creators, innovators, and so much more. For all episodes and further info, verbalhighs.com is the place to go.
Sure is. I'll talk about the website first. I haven't talked about it for a while. I normally tag it on at the end as well as let Jingly Man talk about it. But I don't think I've actually spoken yet on my show about a new page I've put up on the website. And what that is of my own volition, I decided that there isn't a comprehensive resource online yet showcasing New Zealand podcasts. So by New Zealand, I mean the obvious made or hosted here, but I also mean like New Zealand featuring. So Jermaine's Uncle Bertie's Botanarium is up there, but also if there was an episode, featuring a New Zealander, perhaps a true crime show or whatever from overseas, I'd chuck that particular episode on up as well. So you can look at that, verbalhighs.com/NZPD, which stands for New Zealand Podcast Directory. I'm hoping it's going to have a bit of a wiki buzz, and meaning that my email's up there and there's some instructions saying, hey, if I'm missing a show, which I certainly will be, I'll speak about that in a second, I'd love people to get in touch because I'm not really resourced time-wise or sanity-wise to try and find everything. I've made a few rules about what constitutes a podcast. No one's got freaky about it yet because you might go, well, my best of my breakfast radio show is a podcast. And yes, it is. Yes, it is, fine, breakfast team. But that's already been broadcast, and it's a best of or a compendium or whatever of broadcast content. And in nerd circles, this has been talked about a lot lately. What is the modern when we talk about podcasts and podcasting and listening to podcasts? And I think you'll get my drift for what I'm going for, like stuff made for the podcast medium. A good example of where you tension, and not in the negative connotations of that word, but where you see this play out in practice is RNZ. Okay, so RNZ have a whole lot of stuff up called podcasts, and they all are. But what I won't post from them on my page is stuff that's an old broadcast doco, amazing as it is, but I will post the stuff that RNZ are making of late that is fantastic, that where they are commissioning people, wider demographic of people than they have on air, which is fantastic as well and speaks to the power of podcasting, and they make that stuff podcast first and they release it that way, and it might end up on broadcast in one way, shape or form, but it is a podcast, perhaps featuring a younger brown comedian, for example, who haven't heard a lot of those on the panel. That's good, they're catering to everyone. They're our national broadcaster. But back to that, go have a look. The exciting thing about it is that I don't know whether I'm 10% in or 90% in terms of what is out there. Also, one last rule, it's all written there, but it's interesting to talk about. If a show is 5 years old, but it's still up there, and it's a podcast, I'll chuck it on up. But I'm hoping that if things die, people will also say, hey, that show's not available anymore. So get stuck in, bro. Have a hoon, get involved, be collective. Tell me about your friend's show that I missed. I guess I'll know when I'm getting to a higher percentage when the phone stops ringing. When the phone stops ringing, when the pager stops going off. Okay, my guest today, I approached, as I generally do. I think I've had probably two approach me in 86 episodes. Her name is Andrea Reid. She's a cold call in that I don't know her through industry or play. How I did come across her is I went to TEDx because a colleague was speaking at TEDx, and he did a great presentation. Thomas, well done. You probably never hear this, but it's not about you, so I'm not going to talk about that. It was run by an ex-student. He told me I saw that ex-student, and I extended my hand, and he ghosted me. I mean, I know what it's like running an event. Must have been busy. But then I saw him about 2 weeks later, and he ghosted me again. I remember him fondly. So. What Andrea spoke of, I got there a little bit late, partway through her presentation, but essentially she's taken on an excellent, I'm going to swear here, folks, but it's going to be in a sort of a contextual as well as hopefully kind of Billy Connolly, harmless kind of way. If you're offended by this, do remember that someone who's admitted they sexually assault women is running the USA, and we're all fine with that supposedly. So are we fuck for impact? Certainly not in Trump context is okay. Oh, look, I've made it. She's making the moves we need to make to unfuck the world, the way I see it, and that is her. I'll let her tell the story, but a university project turned into, well, are you actually going to do this? And this was creating a pollinator pathway. If you don't know what that is, again, I don't want to ruin a great conversation, but the modern urban phenomena is that we don't have pollinators in the middle of the city. So that's that very people-centric, individual-centric, capitalism-centric, progress, quote-unquote, in a 1960s context, approach to how we live and why we live. So we speak to all of that. It's a lot more than bugs having a highway, though it's really cool that bugs have a highway, and it's not just bugs. I just wanted to make it look like a Pixar scene, which I talk about later in the episode. So I booked that. Sorry about the squeaky nose. I've been a little bit fluey. And then in my new inner city, first time I've lived in a city, I plant my regular chilies and beans because they're the easy stuff when I don't get to do a proper garden. And these beans that my grandma sends me beans for, like a Jack and the Beanstalk sort of scenario, they grow in the apocalypse. They're called scarlet runners. So if you don't get beans, there's something seriously wrong. And I didn't get beans because there's no pollinators where I live. There's some janky pigeons, a confused looking sparrow, and fruit flies. Okay, so I figure that a lot of us are complacent in some ways. We might say, well, I'm not using plastic bags anymore, and that's great, but it would kind of be a stunt move on your part to use plastic bags. Know what I'm saying? And also I'll watch sort of a whole lot of docos and stuff and feel really woke, and then slump into well, it's all too far gone and I can't do anything, and also I'm full of pie. Andrea speaks about how this has turned into a full-time gig. She's leaving her other work, and one thing that struck me, just to close this off, as I say, and not sort of like spoiler the whole convo, I haven't by any means, is she sort of felt, she said genuinely, and felt kind of obliged that, I'm going to be preparing to live on the breadline because I'm running a charity now. And I said this in the podcast, and I'll say it again now. Why do the world fuckers... why is it perfectly okay for the guy or person that deals just in currencies and which way up or down or left or right they go, having a Benz or whatever, and you've got to say, hey, look, just so you all know, when you're donating to this charity, I'm just all about, pollinators and instant noodles from now on. So I think we need to reassess how we treat different people doing different things in our community, and you should support this and take your family down there if you're in Auckland to have a look. Apparently kids get really into it, which doesn't surprise me. It's a great time to make people really aware of the environments around them. My grandmother has instilled me a love of noticing things in places like birds and critters to this day. We speak about that as well. I make a weird Pixar joke at the end that I thought might not come off, but so I sort of half did it and went in and out. And then Andrea said, yes, my friends do call me the Bug Princess. Ha! Oh, how we laughed. Okay, verbalhighs.com, Verbal Highs podcast on Facebook, Verbal Highs on Twitter, Verbal Highs something or other on iTunes. The subscription thing's kind of bunk for me. Like, it's lovely if you subscribe. I don't really see anything from it because I'm in a tiny little country. I'm talking to quite esoteric people. There's no Richie McCaw here. So I think for me it's best that you rate it and do stuff like that publicly and put nice comments and share it. That's where the real action is for this passion project, okay?
This is Dr. Janet's Verbal Highs.
This used to exist just at my place, so it's exciting to be on the road in sunny Bayswater. What's that instrument there?
It's a dulcimer.
And do you played stringed instruments?
Yeah, my partner plays the guitars, I play a little bit of guitar, and then I play the dulcimer.
Oh, so that's actually for playing, not for aesthetic purposes. Where's it from?
A lot of people actually have them for aesthetic purposes because they look so pretty. They just hang them on the walls, but they don't actually know how to play them.
So, what country is it from?
Appalachian Mountains.
And how did you discover that as an instrument to play, travelling?
No, I'm folky at heart. My mum is a folk musician and brought me up in the folk music scene.
There's a folk music scene like a big one in New Zealand?
I'm not sure if it's big comparative to other countries, but it's a nice little scene.
Kind of hippie vibes to it.
Yeah, my mum was a hippie.
Yeah.
Oh, still is, really.
Yeah. How many strings on it?
4.
So, I'll just introduce you quickly. So with me today, I have Andrea, Reid, founder of Pollinator Paths, a movement that aims to connect Auckland's parks and reserves together to make pollination pathways. I told you when I teed this up that it's kind of a conversation. That's a bit different to an interview in a lot of ways, but at the same time, based on the fact you've probably had to pitch the idea a few times, and part of doing this is, bringing as many people into knowing about what you're doing as possible. Explain what pollination pathways is.
Right, so Pollinator Paths is an initiative that I started back in university. It was my final year project of a landscape architecture degree.
Yeah.
So as landscape architects, we're responsible for designing parks and reserves and highway corridors, lots of big planting schemes, any planting you see in the public realm, but any of the hardscape as well, so any of our plazas and streetscapes and places like that. And so in your final year, you can do almost whatever you want, and it's trying to solve some sort of issue within landscape architecture.
Yeah.
And I was seeing all these reports on the news at the time, this was about 5 years ago, about the bees are dying. If the bees die, they're going to take us with them. Like, there's going to be this big catastrophe. The world is going to end if we have no pollinators. And I was like, wow, that seems crazy that our entire world is so reliant on this singular species. And I started looking into the honeybee and going, why are we relying on this one species? Especially in New Zealand, this creature isn't even native to here.
No, right.
Like, what are we doing? I'm like, I'm sure it can't just be honeybees that pollinate, right? So then I started to look into it and went, wow, okay, it's not just bees. Like, we have so many bird pollinators, which a lot of people do know about. We have lots of other insects. We actually have native bees. Like, I never knew we had native bees, and neither do most people I talk to.
I kind of did, but it became a lot more apparent during your TED talk. That the kind of bee that we know of is just one small part of our ecosystem.
It's just a tiny part of the puzzle.
Yeah.
And it's quite an important part, but it actually gets a lot of undeserved attention, and it's mainly because of money, because that's how the world works, because they produce honey, and by producing honey, they're able to produce money.
Do you think there's something else? We'll get back to you explaining the rest of the project in a second. Do you think there's something also in the fact that awareness campaigns, or what gets awareness, often is almost a sort of Disney-fied decision, if you know what I mean? Do you know what I mean by that?
Yeah,
the
we were
honeybee
talking
is
about this recently, because it's like a lot of the things that get the attention are the cute and cuddly ones, and when it's insects, a lot of people are scared of insects, especially of bees, and then they find out that flies are also pollinators, and they go, I hate flies. Well, you can't have that cute cuddly vibe that encourages people to donate and look after them and actually even care about them, whereas you go honey and people go, oh well, I like honey, so they then in effect like bees,
and fluffy and yellow black thing.
Exactly. It's slightly easier to market, but it's quite sad.
So as a research project, because it was, as you say, end of year research based, me being a researcher, that's the first step in your research process. And by the way, I did the most annoying thing. I called your whole initiative the wrong thing. It's Pollinator Paths.
That's the one. Happens all the time.
I know, but I wasn't gonna let that go. So you do the first step of your research, and it's like, okay, hey, there's not just the bee, there's other pollinators, and then the next step is.
I was like, wow, so where are all these other pollinators? What are their numbers? Like, wanted to know all of that research, because I myself am not an ecologist. So I wasn't going and counting bees or anything like that. So I was really looking for this data, and there's just so little on it, because these researchers who are doing it just aren't getting the research grants because it's not making money. Even though pollination services in and of themselves, if we lost them, would be such a terrible financial loss to our country, because, we can't pollinate our food properly anymore, and when you're shipping honeybees around, and honeybees are already struggling, putting a lot of risk on this singular species. So if we were able to bolster our native ones, then we might be able to solve this issue before it happens. But the fact that it hasn't happened yet, it the money isn't there to support the research, so we don't know where half of our native bees are.
So you mean the money isn't there to research our natives?
Yeah.
Okay.
And it's because they're not the cute, cuddly natives.
Right.
We've got plenty for our Kiwis and whatnot.
Right. Okay. What sort of people provide money? Like the honeybee industry, for example?
Yeah, well, that's why there's a lot of honeybee funding that's able to be done. Right. Because it is those places that are funding it.
Right. So a landscape architect, you're approaching this, you don't have the ecological knowledge, you're looking for data.
Yeah.
The next step.
So I went and talked to a lot of people who are researching it as best as they can. Nairi Hart and Jamie Stavitt are really great native bee researchers, for example. So I'll often work with them to get that sort of data. We really want to start monitoring our existing pathways, but we want to do baseline monitoring first. So before we finish this Grey Lynn pollinator path, which is our first project, we want to be able to get a baseline result and be like, okay, so what pollinators are here already? Have we even got, I'm sure we'll have some, obviously, but what sort of breadth, what variety do we have, what numbers do we have? So I want that baseline study done, which we need to get research funding for, and then we want to have a 1 year point, 2 year point, 3 year point to see that these pollinator paths are working, because we've kind of had to use the philosophy of build it and the pollinators will come, which they have. Like, I'm not an ecologist, but I can see that they're there and they weren't before. It was just a patch of grass and maybe you got the odd honeybee, but now you've got just a whole breadth of different pollinators that are within that place. So
we've jumped a little there. What did you propose to set up, and what has been set up that is the pathways we speak of?
Yeah, so when it finished as a university project, most of the feedback a landscape architect will get at those crits is, okay, but how is it really landscape architecture?
Right.
And they'll get wanky sort of questions like that. And so I was like all ready for that. And then the question I got posed was, okay, cool, so how are you going to do this? When are you going to do this? When are you talking to council? What's your next plans? And I'd sort of worked all the way up to this big end point, as you do in university.
I'm done now. I'm out.
Think about past that. No.
Yeah.
But it just really clicked that I was just like, I've spent an entire year on this thing. Why would I waste all of this knowledge and research and information? And if my landscape architect think that it's going to work, then why not?
You mean
give it a shot?
My tutors?
Yeah. Exactly. So so the people on the crit board are a range of different landscape architects from within the industry as well. And they gave really positive feedback. The things that they were pointing out are still the things I'm having problems with now, like getting funding and ongoing maintenance, but they're things that you can get over.
But you still haven't explained what exactly it is that you laid out for the creatures of Auckland, I guess. Like, what does the initiative entail? What have you? What's been set up?
What's a pollinator path?
Yeah, what's a pollinator path?
Yeah, so a pollinator path is basically, we have to think about how pollinators move around, and they don't care about property boundaries. So it's not like we're just going to put in a park. It's that we want to have connected ecosystems because we have to design for the lowest common denominator. And so our birds and bees can fly for miles at a time, but our smaller creatures, so like our non-flying insects and our lizards, skinks, they barely like to run between two Mullumbeckia bushes. So we need to create really connected habitat if we want to be able to bring those creatures back into our urban areas.
And so where does the path start at the moment, the one you've set up?
Yeah, the one I've started at the moment is to connect Grey Lynn Park and Cox's Bay Reserve. Yeah. So Grey Lynn's a suburb just off the edge of the city. And our first installation is in Hakanoa Reserve, which is halfway between those two parks, which is a small park that we designed. And our second installation that's been installed is at the Kalmana Gardens, which is a beautiful organic community farm, which is what we want to encourage, is more locally grown food like that. So it's right by Cox's Bay Reserve. Yeah. So one of the small roads, I think it's Hakanoa.
Okay, so considering that I came out here to Bayswater and said to you, I didn't even know I'd be on the North Shore. That gave an indication of my sense of geography in Auckland. So that's not actually going through the central city yet, is it? The path that you've proposed?
No. It's on the edge of the city.
Right. So I know the side that I'm on. Great. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I know where Cox's Bay Reserve is. So, what have you noticed? Just on the ground, what do you see, and what do you observe, and what do the locals tell you? Locals are always the best knowledge, right? So, exactly. So how long has it been functioning, and what have you seen
Well, we installed that first one,
Yeah.
which was our prototype park to show how the entire pathway would work once
Yeah.
we had it connected back in October 2016.
Yeah.
And it's now half the plants are almost taller than me.
Yeah.
So it's definitely thrived and done really well.
Yeah.
The locals really love it. I often like to just sort of watch people watch the people that are there, and then I'll see them stuffing. They might pick a little bit of rosemary to take home with them.
Yeah.
Like, oh, what's that creature? Oh, look, there's some bees.
So you are seeing more critters there.
Oh, definitely.
I know a lot of stuff manages to hide from us, but there's just there's evidence day by day of more activity. Is there? It's
the
fantastic.
coolest thing that I noticed was when we installed that park, and it was just a patch of grass.
Yeah.
We were laying out the plants ready to put down, and one of them was a swan plant that we put down, and then out of nowhere came along this monarch butterfly before it was even planted and landed on the swan plant. So it just showed how as soon as you've got their habitat there, they will come.
And you wonder what that monarch butterfly would have done otherwise, because I spoke to you about this. It was sort of interesting timing. Like, I went to the TEDx, I saw your talk, I thought, well, that's really interesting, that's really valuable, and bought my first property, which is an apartment in town, and it's got a particularly big balcony, and so there's a real opportunity to grow stuff out there. And I'd moved all my chili plants from Kingsland, and I planted some runner beans that my grandmother sent me, and I've only got 4 beans out of everything this season. And it was sort of like, what's the word? I think unsettling's the word.
Yeah.
Like, it just dawned on me, oh my God, it's because there's no natural ecosystem in the middle of the city. I'm living
in a concrete jungle.
I'm living in a concrete jungle. Is there anything off that path that I can do and people in locations like I'm in can do? I know it won't create a pathway, but what sort of things should I be planting or doing somewhere like that where I've got that space?
Well, it's definitely, you're in probably the hardest spot you possibly
I'm
could be.
I'm on Wakefield Street, like just up from Merrill Drive.
Yeah. So, being in the city is definitely the hardest, and that's where we know there's the most need for a pollinator path, but it's also one of the most difficult places to put them
Right.
Mainly because of money and space.
Yeah.
Like, it's so tight in there and everything's concrete. Like, the way to be able to financially easily do a pollinator path is by planting out things like grass berms and things where you don't have to like manipulate the landscape too much, but you can change it enough to really make a positive difference. Whereas when you're within a concreted landscape, you need to start doing things like pollinator walls, living roofs, and they get a lot more expensive, so it's a lot harder to pitch those at the beginning of a project, but we're definitely looking for how we can start to implement those things once we've sort of shown how this will work, and then go, okay, next level, let's get it into the city, let's connect Victoria Park and Albert Park and have this.
So that's what the prototype is for, is to like do it somewhere arguably a little simpler, a little shorter, and just test what does and doesn't work. That must be really, I mean, that's sort of a big thing Auckland faces in general, right? Like, I'm trying to think of the term, like, there is a term for it which has slipped my mind, but you're kind of introducing initiatives that 20, 30 years ago maybe should have been initiated. Like, what have you learnt a lot about sort of town planning? And can you speak on that?
It was done.
Yeah,
a little bit.
My God, you've got so many areas of sort of expertise about the city now.
Yeah, exactly. Well, it's quite interesting when you look way back as how the original Auckland plan was designed. Like, the plan for Auckland had like ring roads around our mountains and was a lot more sensible, so you could get around and had a lot more logic to it. And you look at the mess that you got, and it was basically because they're like, we don't want to pay for an actual plan that suits this landscape. We'll just plonk over whatever we were doing in England at the time, and it just doesn't work for our hilly structure, and then we just get this mess of all these awkward roads that don't go anywhere.
And you probably learnt about, like, it was global, at least in developed nations, like that particularly 1960s, like roads and cars are everything, and that's what I was thinking about it, like, because this even speaks to like human pathways and how we live on foot. Spaghetti Junction in the middle of like, let's forget insects and birds for a while. Like, that's almost like the human version of what we're talking about in a way.
And
like
we put humans first with their pathways.
When I lived in Kingsland, I was like, why is there that huge like ring of roads between me and Ponsonby and me and all these places? It's like it's bizarre. You talked about funding, and all this institutional stuff lies at the heart of a lot of this, like in terms of fixing things. Have you found a lot of, genuine support from organisations and so on wanting to get involved in this?
Yeah, it's a surprising amount of support. Like, I thought that it would be like, oh, no one's going to care about these bugs like I do. I was like a bug girl when I was a kid. I loved the things, but I'm just like, not everyone loves bugs.
But it's about more than bugs,
so
like
so much more than that, exactly. And we've had incredible support. So we had the Waitemata Local Board are the ones who have funded everything so far. The Auckland Council also has played a part in that, being connected. We've even managed to get a little bit of support from Auckland Transport with getting like land ownership approvals and things like that. And
what does that mean? What's land ownership approvals?
So when you're working within the public realm and you're crossing over multiple property boundaries, one of your biggest things is you now need to get approval from every single landowner.
Oh boy, you really are dealing with the system.
I did like the hardest thing you possibly could. So you have to get land ownership approval if you're doing stuff in berms for Auckland Transport. A lot of that legislation's changing now, and they're passing over that responsibility to Auckland Council, because there's a lot of mess around how people are expected to maintain their own berms, but they don't actually own them, so they can't really do what they want. And so that often really irks people, because they're like, why should I go and mow my berm every couple of weeks for you, yet you won't even let me plant some flowers on it. And then Auckland Transport side of that argument is like, but people plant really dumb stuff and then it breaks the services underneath the berms and it grows too high. And you're like, okay, I also understand your points. So if we had a nice little middle ground, which is what I kind of push for, because as a landscape architect, I kind of know that, if you plant the wrong thing, you can get yourself in a lot of trouble. But if you do a layered mulching style so that you're not digging deep and you don't plant things that grow any higher than 600, then you won't get in the way of traffic sight lines. Like, there is like a nice little happy middle ground there that we could all keep to, and then we could all have beautiful planted berms.
And what I'm hearing is and this is not a surprise, it occurred to me from the beginning, your project not only speaks to a lot of kind of basically like what we need to do to unfuck the world, but also what you're up against is like this long-term individual approach to living, to property ownership, to I worked hard for this, which I get, we need rules for this and versus like the collectivism model of humanity that is kind of the foundation of civilization, that kind of needing to return. But it's sounding like, although you've come up against frustrations, it sounds like a lot of people in higher places are actually, really realising on a human level that things need to change, right?
Totally, yeah. Whether we'll be able to make that institutional change to change it quick enough, I don't know. And that is almost another project that I've sort of dedicated my time to as much as I can on this one, that just actually changing the system is just a whole nother level. Totally support it, but wouldn't even know where to start.
There's a few things there, like, I'll speak about this later, but it's that, like, think global, act local, or like small things at a time in terms of what you're doing. So later on I will ask you about, smaller things people can do rather than trying to, like, smash the whole system at the same time. But another thing, if I flip what I just said in terms of individual everyone wants to be comfortable, everyone wants rewards from their hard work, we all need an income and so on. So if I flip that and speak on your situation, when you first left study, there must have been a part of you that was like, well, how do I reconcile this great sort of community project and all this work ahead of me with the fact that I've just trained for a career? And
that was definitely hard. And I also graduated in a recession, and there were no jobs at all.
I thought that's a good reason to start it.
It was a great reason for me to go, well, I don't want to just work in a cafe. I also had a really major surgery as soon as I'd finished my assignment. So after that, I needed that recovery time anyway. So I was able to utilise, because I still was thinking and wanting trying to do stuff, that time to sort of design and go, okay, let's figure out how we will approach council with this and get those initial things sorted, and actually got that first park installed before I started working? Around the same time, I started my first job as a landscape architect at a company called ACOM, which is a big global conglomerate, big engineering company, which everyone was just like, how come the hippie girl has got the job at the engineering company? This makes no sense. And I was just like, no, but what do they engineer?
What do they engineer?
Mainly big roading projects.
Roading. We do roading and tobacco. Yeah.
Not quite tobacco, but it actually, like, the CEO was really supportive of my initiative, and he gave me time to work on it. That I sometimes find that these big companies, like, they might be doing some bad stuff, but they do often want to change, and ACOM was a really great one for wanting to push these more sustainable projects and thinking about how we do these things and going, hey, this highway is going through lizard habitat, we need to be monitoring these lizards and monitoring these bats and thinking of the best way we can possibly do this.
Wow, so they tied in the knowledge and the advocacy work you were doing locally for the pathways in with their larger roading projects, right? Are you still with them?
I'm not still with ACOM. Unfortunately, our team dissolved a little bit there. We had a very small team, and our bosses ended up moving to other places, which made it hard as a grad to really do much on your own. So I ended up working for another engineering company called WSP, previously called Opus, which is where I work now. And they're a similar sort of company, and they actually gave me even more support. That was also from a CEO level, so you can see that it's actually coming from quite a high level that they want to make these changes. And it was actually him who approached me, because he was just like, hey, one of my people's doing a TED talk, you're new, hello, what are you doing?
And you know what I reckon, like, I think if we completely nothing to do with your situation and who you've worked for, like in a holistic sense, I think that whether people are or organisations are genuinely concerned, or whether they are initiating things that are needed owing to public support, really it's here nor there, because it's happening, right?
Exactly.
Right? Okay.
Yeah, and so you can kind of capitalise on the fact that there's a lot of good marketing around these things, and it is a good way of persuading big corporates to actually make beneficial change. Like, if that makes them change, like, at least they're changing.
Absolutely. By the way, when I look at this, I'm not checking my Insta. I'm just looking for the actual list of questions I put up for you. So going back a bit, you talked about loving bugs as a kid. Yeah. And I was thinking about that because I think a lot of my awareness of, like, small creatures and plants and stuff comes from my grandmother in particular. She's, like, still the person that has me, like, spotting particular birds and trees and stuff. Where did it come from in your family? Are you a family of sort of ecologically minded people, or is there a particular passionate person? Or
it was pretty much me and my mum against the world in a lot lot because unfortunately my father died just before I was born, so she was a solo mum bringing me up. But my connected family, like, we all grew up out west, so I was used to growing up in that beautiful Terurangi Langholm bush, and that was my playground. That's what I knew. These things that are now called natural playgrounds, it's like that was just what we played with.
It was called outside.
Go outside.
I'm going to leave at 9. I'll be back at 6. I may pop in for lunch. Anyway, go on.
And at one of my family's place, they lived in this beautiful old pole house in Langholm with stained glass windows, very standard Langholm house, and we had a section of bush that would go all the way down to the beach, and so me and my half brothers, that would be where we would play and where we grew up, and so all my family really instilled that within me. And they would probably just get classed as hippies and activists and all that sort of thing, but they just had this wealth of knowledge. Folkies, exactly. Folk music. All that sort of stuff, but right. And, like, the funny thing is, if I tried to do pollinator paths when I was my mum's generation, if she tried to do it at my age, she would have just got laughed at and seen as a crazy hippie. Whereas you do it now and people are like, oh my God, they were right, we actually need these things.
Right.
Because of the changing times.
Oh, the kind of radical greenie.
Radical greenie, yeah.
And
I try to not do it in too much of a radical way, because I want it to be something that works with our existing system, because it's so hard to change the system.
So Another thing the subtext I heard there, and my listeners will be like, here's Lewis going on again about like back in my day versus now. Yeah. Are you kind of alluding also that you've found that kids are sort of less connected to outdoor environments these days?
So much so.
Go on, tell me about that. It's interesting.
Well, I think it's mainly because of technology. I think my generation only just escaped that.
Yeah. Like, how old are you?
I'm 28.
Right. Okay. Yeah. So you're bottom end of millennial.
There was no. There was no phones when you were a kid. Yeah. And I think kids shouldn't be allowed a phone when they're a kid because it's just messing with them.
Well, there was phones. They were just inside and like connected to the wall. I know.
Yeah. And dial around.
There were no phones.
There were no phones at all. No one could contact anybody.
No petrol engines.
Yeah. I got my first phone for emergencies, and that was when I was an intermediate high school sort of age. I didn't have internet. It was just, it could text and call. Yeah. And that was all you needed, I felt. I'm sounding really old now.
That's right.
I feel like technology is... I mean, it's just a tool, right? So if we use the tool effectively, then we could use it in ways that can really help the ecology and help the environment, and we're more connected so we can learn more and we can research more. There's 100 million good reasons. Yeah. There's also 100 million bad reasons that also really disconnect us from nature and ecology. Yeah. Like when I babysit kids, I found that all they want to do is sit there on their cell phones, and I'm just like, why don't we go for a walk? Like, I don't want to go for a walk, you know?
Really?
It's so like they don't want to be outside as much. I'm slowly starting to bring that out in them, but...
You mean bring that out in them, like the kids who are in the neighbourhoods where you have this project going, or the kids you look after? Probably both.
Just any kids, because I do school talks as well, and it was actually quite disheartening because I started the talk in the same way I start the TED talk of imagine a world without pollinators. What do you think would happen? Yeah. Thinking like the kids, I don't know what the kids would say.
Will the internet stay on?
Yeah, I was expecting more of that sort of response, but I actually got a kid that put their hand up and they're like, well, we're all going to die. And I was like, oh my God, like that was a very morbid response from a child. And I was just like, well, if we don't do something that could potentially be an inevitability, but isn't it sad that that's what kids are thinking?
Did he say it in a really monotone kind of like horror film voice?
We're all going to die.
Yeah.
Do you think it's also another oft kind of talked about thing generationally? Do you think there's something in conditioning as well? So it's not just kids wanting to be on technology, but the fact that people like have their kids on a tighter leash these days. Like you know how I joked, but was serious before about the leaving in the morning, popping back for lunch, and then we'll just be somewhere in
That's
the hills.
That's totally what we did. We were just down in the bush somewhere. Like who knows? Whereas if a kid got lost in the bush now, which is technically what we would have been every day, then you'd have the police round in no time. Yeah. Like
I don't think the world. I mean, I've read something about the statistics. I think the stats say the world actually isn't that much more dangerous than it was back then. We just have been sold the idea of the world being a scarier place.
Well, you've got more information, so as soon as you hear on the other side of the world something happening and some kid getting kidnapped, all of those just sort of compound and add up to thinking, oh my God, my kid's going to die. Yeah. Whereas before, you didn't have all that. You just had the knowledge that you had from your local neighbours and community, and you'd be like, oh my God, there might have been one abduction in the entirety of their lives that you ever heard about. So you wouldn't have even thought of it as a problem.
So if we so I moved us to kids getting abducted. So if we move back to I think kids are often the greatest place to start for carrying on the baton for this. Like, have you noticed the children in the area you've got this almost becoming like caregivers and making sure everything's ticking along?
Yeah, there's some great kids that live next door to the Hakanoa Reserve, and there's like a little library book box. Yeah. And so when they were there, they looked through that box and they found one that was on bugs. And they got so excited and they got the book out and then they were trying to find all of the different bugs. Right. They also went and restocked the pollinator wall and filled it with all the different sticks and stones and bracken from around the park, because it was just like a fun game, because it was just like, okay, here's a list of things that you need to find to put in the wall. Which ones can you find? Yeah. And like once you get kids out of the mindset of technology and into these natural areas to explore,
their imagination,
they love it. Like they thrive in that sort of environment.
And so speaking about the contraptions and so on, like when we started, you mentioned just the plants, and the reason, because obviously this is just a audio medium. We're dealing with what they call theatre of the mind, which is giving people an idea of what this thing looks like. You mentioned plants, but you didn't really speak on the other contraptions, I guess, that are involved. You've got little kind of like, I saw a little bee house. You've got this sort of conical, I assume, are they to emulate a kind of a hive or whatever? Like, can you talk about some of the other devices that I've seen and what they do? Because I found that really interesting as well. Like a human designed version of something natural.
Yes.
Yeah.
And part of why we did that is that disconnect people have with messy places.
Yeah.
Like, messy is great for pollinators, but people see it as unkept and like it's not being looked after.
Yeah.
So we thought that by having a pollinator wall where all of these things are put into little boxes, it gives people the concept of order and organisation. Pollinators don't mind, but it makes people feel it's tidy. And once that's there, they're like, oh, that's done on purpose. Oh, interesting. And it creates that intrigue so that people ask questions.
It's not going to affect my property value.
No, exactly.
Yeah.
Well, it is. It's a big thing that people worry about. But having more plants in an area actually increases property values.
Oh, so that's the point before. That's interesting. So it wasn't. I thought it was out of practical pollination necessity. But you're saying if you just okay. But
there's also bumblebee boxes and leafcutter bee boxes.
Yeah.
And we try not to push them too much because they are also for our exotic bees, but it's a really good educational tool because we don't have specially designed boxes for our natives yet because they nest in the ground. So all you can do is leave an exposed patch of clay dirt for them to nest in.
Yeah, right.
And maybe put a little sign that says, hey, this is what it is. It's just that people don't know. Yeah. And then they go, oh, how come that bank isn't planted?
Yeah, right. So you've
got to have these educational signs that tell people these things. So as soon as it's quite
interesting. There's a lot to this.
Yeah, there's some interesting studies overseas where they had like a patch of grass that wasn't mown so that wildflowers could grow.
Yeah.
And then everyone was like, that's messy.
Yeah.
And then they just mowed the front strip of it and people were like, oh, that's interesting. Why is that the way it is? It's obviously meant to be like that because there's some element of human intervention.
Right,
and
interesting.
Then they put like a little barrier against it and they go, oh, I wonder why. And then they get intrigued by it. And then they put a little sign up and then they go, oh my gosh, this is to save the native wood pigeon. We need to
and also,
make sure that this stays like this forever.
I get it. And it also sounds like people get uneasy in a suburb or a very human environment when there's a sense of like abandonment or disorder or whatever. They need. That's what I'm hearing there as well. They need some sense that
just a little hint of it. Yeah,
other humans are doing this for a reason.
Yes, there's a reason for it, and simply a sign will do it.
Yeah,
people
right.
Go, oh wow, there's pollinators here. Oh my goodness, oh look at the flowers, and then they start to get intrigued by it. So we try and do it messy enough for the pollinators, but just tidy enough so that humans don't complain about it.
Yeah. And then I was just jumping back a bit on my balcony because I noticed you mentioned native birds specifically. Why don't things like sparrows and so on pollinate?
They probably do.
I'm just wondering how my 4 beans came about, but I don't
and
think it
only
was.
Sparrows
I don't think it was I don't think it was one of the manky. I don't know. You've got to see where I am. I'm sandwiched between the back of 4 buildings and air conditioning.
God. Yeah.
It wouldn't. I highly doubt it would have been one of the pigeons. They don't look. They don't look great, those city pigeons. I'm joking. I think it's more that they wouldn't fly up there. So there must be some. There must be some things that make it.
Birds that do. But you often find with the exotic creatures that for our native plants specifically, they're not as well adapted to pollinating those things correctly.
Yeah.
So like they might not have the right length beak to get into the flower. If it's a bird, the honeybees will often rob the nectar like from the side of flax flowers without actually pollinating them.
Yeah.
Like there's lots of creatures that will just sort of take the nectar but won't actually be helping with pollination as well because they sort of haven't grown together to have that mutual relationship.
I'm not a creationist by any stretch, but you do have to wonder how these, everything seems made to fit somehow, right? You must have
more evolved to adapt to what they had.
Yeah,
so
right.
Like a lot of because we didn't have any mammals. That's why we have a lot of bats that'll just like crawl across the ground.
Well, that's why we have a bunch of birds that are like basically walking
Our birds
KFC boxes to predators because
exactly, and that's why we've got such a big predator problem. Is because we didn't have any mammals for them to have to compete against, so they're all useless at competing against rats and stoats.
I do understand evolution versus creationism. It was a joke, but
of course,
but you must have, and it's a part of it is about public education. You work so hard on this. You must have had a bit of a head shake moment when that petition went up to introduce the koala to New Zealand.
I thought it was like a joke or something.
No.
There is like
serious.
an island that has mainly Australian creatures, like the wallabies and kangaroos and things on it, in New Zealand somewhere.
Really?
And I thought if you were going to do it, maybe do it there. But
just chuck. That's right. Chuck them
if it's
on there.
already an Australian-based island in New Zealand with that sort of ecology, but it would potentially be very damaging, I imagine. You never know what's going to happen. It's best not to mess with these things.
No, I just thought, surely history has taught us otherwise. That's what I was meaning. And have you... I'm guessing you've looked to initiatives overseas. When I was somewhere in the middle of Europe, end of last year, I noticed a university, because I read the little signs, had devices out in the middle of... does it matter? Let's say, where was I? It might have been Krakow in Poland or somewhere. No, doesn't... the city I was in before that. Did the devices and the initiatives and the way you plan this, did you look to what had already been done elsewhere, or did you?
Totally. Yeah, New Zealand's a little bit behind with all those sorts of things.
Really? Yeah. So that related to that. Before you go on, who's approached this really well, kind of city and country wise?
The main one that's doing the most similar thing to what I'm doing is the Seattle pollinator pathway.
Yeah.
And that was done probably about 7 or so years ago, and that was about connecting berms, so that 2 parks were connected, and she had a lot of ecologists working on that one. Things people that they're doing in Singapore are pretty crazy. They're investing a lot of money into green technology, so we can look to them for like green walls and green roofs and those sorts of technologies. The New York High Line is quite an interesting example of how you're turning old infrastructure that was a concrete grey space that's already connecting your city into something that can be green and ecological.
What's a High Line?
So the High Line is, I think it was a railway line, like a raised railway line that sort of ran through the city.
Yeah. I've seen footage of that. Yeah, where the subway tracks, are elevated. Yeah.
So now they've turned it into a linear park that now goes the entire way through the city, and what a beautiful place it now is. Yeah. Like, it just made such a transformational difference, and they planted a lot of wildflowers and great things for their native creatures, and it actually became a little hub for them to be able to move through the city as well. So people are creating things that in effect are pollinator paths throughout the world. The hardest thing for us is that we have such a unique ecosystem and a unique set of pollinators that we do need to do things differently here that work specially for those creatures.
Are you meaning, it gets back to what we were speaking about before, the uniqueness of New Zealand flora and fauna, like other countries are arguably dealing with the same data sets and the same creatures and so on. That's really interesting.
But their research numbers don't mean much to us in New Zealand, unfortunately.
It's always, positive. The positive aspects are always the best to talk about, but the amount of work and learning and advocating that's gone into this, what frustrations have presented themselves to you?
It's always constant frustrations. Normally it's just from...
I wish you could have seen that look, everybody.
My life's a constant frustration.
Lack of time.
My biggest thing is lack of time, which is why I've now gone down to part-time at my work. And we'll be finishing up there in the next few months. So I'm hoping to be able to earn just enough money from my design skills for doing pollinator paths and running the charity that I can live and exist. But great. I've just gotten to that point of where money doesn't matter. I just need to make this thing happen. So I guess that's probably the hardest thing I have to deal with transitioning this and being able to do it full time, being able to actually dedicate myself to it, which is what I've always wanted to do.
Great. So what I talked to you about before, like when you first graduated, that you're basically you're bucking the system we live in, and then on a personal level, it's the same thing. You're
still stuck in that system. You still need to be able to afford to put food on the table. I have a pretty minimal sort of amount of money I need to get by, but it's like you still need something. Like,
well, also you
can't just do everything for free, which a lot of people expect because it's a charity.
I don't think you should be obliged to be living on the bones of your ass for doing something that is so for the collective good. I want you. You know, I think you need to hear that from other people. It's like I don't think you have to sell that you're going to be living just so you can just kind of get by. You know, it's a advocacy is as important or more so than a lot of other things in society.
And it's hard that it doesn't get valued in that same way, even though it's so incredibly important.
Yeah.
Whereas you're always expected to do things voluntarily, but there's only like so much voluntary time one person can give.
Yeah.
And they expect the same thing of graphic designers and musicians. Like both things I also am. I seem to pick great career paths where people don't think they should get paid.
Look, I my postgrad, when how I ended up working in education, my postgrad year was an area called creative industries. And a lot of it was about the life I had actually just lived for the 15, 20 years beforehand, which is what you're talking about, which is like, you know, how do you know, the what's an example, the hospitality owner who pays for everything else but expects the entertainment to like work for free drinks or whatever, you know.
And it's like, I don't want more alcohol, I want food.
Someone, a performer from overseas once said to me when I told him a story, he said, tell them that, what did he say? Tell them that alcohol doesn't pay the rent, motherfucker. And I'm like... Yeah. And it's problematic for other reasons we won't go into if your whole life involves getting paid and booze and cigarettes. How is this supported financially? Have you got backers or is it
we're
donations as well?
Them.
Yep, go on.
So we're in the process of transitioning into a charity, so we can't accept money just yet, but very soon we'll then be able to accept donations. We're going to do a big charity launch. We've already got a bunch of great corporate sponsors who are interested in supporting us and have been supporting us already. New World were fantastic. They provided a bunch of those bee boxes and... They also provided a bunch of plants from their My Little Gardens campaign. Like they did some great stuff for us. Karma Cola are always giving us drinks for our events. There's lots of like little companies, like little local companies that will just give what they can. There's people who have done, I hate to say it, face painting and musician things for free because they're my friends who are musicians.
But that's different. That's for
a charity.
It's when you remove the capitalism imbalance out of it, it's a different.
Exactly, because you're all sort of giving and taking and helping each other out.
Yeah, which is back to the whole community ethos behind this. You probably find this frustrating to hear because you're the opposite of this. But I think for a lot of us, there's a sort of and it's almost. I don't just mean pollination here. I mean a whole wider lot of stuff we're talking about with where people are at the moment. I think there's almost can be a collective shrug at like it's all too hard.
Oh yeah, I've done it myself several times. And what am I doing? This is so hard.
But you are doing it. But for someone who is concerned and watches that Netflix doco, but then turns it off and just goes back to what can people be doing on a day-to-day basis? Do you think to improve our lot?
So I think you start small and you think about what you're doing in your own back garden. So you can think about, okay, how could I make this space just a little bit more friendly to pollinators? Perhaps I could think about what's in my garden already and maybe plant some things that flower at different times throughout the year when I've never got anything flowering so that the pollinators have something to get nectar from during that time. That's a really simple first step.
So I'll just stop you there for a sec. What are really sort of like, for example, the runner beans my grandmother sends me always grow. What are some really sort of resilient options for different seasons?
It's an interesting question. And a lot of people have asked, like, can't you just give me a pollinator plant list and I'll just plant those things? But what I don't like to do about that is one of the most important things is biodiversity and having a real variance of different plants and having things that work with your existing ecosystem. So I feel like everything in a way needs to be specifically designed. There are some great guidelines. I think Auckland Council has a pollinator guideline. Trees for Bees have an interesting guideline. But let's think of something, things need to be eco-sourced. So like the kawhai, for example, you shouldn't just go and buy a kawhai. You should actually think about what area am I in, which kawhai should I buy for this area, so that ecological variation still occurs.
Yeah. So is there good resources for that? I asked this on a really practical level, just for when I eventually do. You got to see this, but it's not like a balcony you'd expect. It's like my balcony is the size of a studio apartment, so it's a big balcony.
Yeah.
So I thought about that. I really need to consider what goes out there. Are there good, like, so for example, my mother suggested that they paid someone to come in and give them advice on what to plant for a number of reasons. Are there sort of good local resources online for where I get advice on what to plant where I am, or is it just a matter of doing a lot of research like you would with anything else?
Yeah, pretty much. You do need to do your research, know your plants. You can ask someone like me for a specific area, because that's kind of what landscape architects or landscape garden designers are trained to do. Because it does. It takes a wealth of knowledge that you gather over years and years and years, and it can be really hard when you're first starting out. In fact, I myself find it hard to know what to do with my own place sometimes, and just having the time to be able to do it.
Yeah. I asked you, so you were one point into like what can people do on a day-to-day basis, which was planting.
Yeah.
Before we go on with a few more ideas about that, you talked about the landscape architect and landscape gardener. That's something I forgot to ask you right at the beginning. What is a landscape architect?
Okay. So a landscape architect generally focuses more on the public realm.
Yeah.
So they'll do parks, reserves, playgrounds. Yeah. We do highway planting. We do streetscapes.
Yeah.
We do, anything that affects the public realm. The gaps between the buildings is basically what you think of. The entire space, how it's shaped. But we've worked in collaboration with urban designers, transport planners, all the different place, because at an engineering firm it's great because you've got all of them in-house, so you can just go directly talk to the architects, you can go and talk to the transport planner, the geologist, the contaminated land guys. So because you need a whole range of different jobs to be able to work together in our public realm space, whereas a landscape gardener or designer will look more at what you do in your private back gardens. So I myself am not a garden designer. Like, I can tell you great pollinator plants to put in your garden, but designing like backyard swimming pools and those really fancy plants or a Japanese garden or something like that isn't really my forte, whereas those people will specifically focus on just what's done within residential areas. Yeah, well, it's like a sort of difference between architecture and an interior design or something. Exactly, it's the same sort of difference. So planting a variety of plants that encourage pollination that also don't just flower in summer and then disappear for the other seasons. That's the first thing. Any other advice? So another good bit of advice is to not just think about the nectar that they want, but the habitat that they require. So whether it's leaving sticks and stones and leaf matter and things like that for them to hide in, or whether it's thinking about particular plants they need to lay their eggs on. So butterflies are quite an interesting example of this because they're so fussy. Are they? So one plant for monarchs and so on. Monarch butterflies need swan plants, but we've also got copper butterflies which need Muhlenbeckia, and we've got admirals which need nettles, and no one plants nettles anymore because they sting and they need to go in the shade, and you can't plant them in public areas, which I'm trying to push past, and you can't even get them anymore because there's actually a real sort of universal problem with our where we get plants from, because there's these really big plant places that are taking over and they're managing to do things en masse. All comes back to the same thing. All our little nurseries are disappearing, and it's our little nurseries like the Oratia Plant Nursery and McKechnie Nurseries in Coatesville. That's where I would get all my eco-sourced plants from. But they're shutting down because I can't compete anymore. But also I'd imagine those large... No more nettles. Where do we get them from? Well, you're right. So related to that, correct me if I'm wrong, but I'd imagine that the large garden centres actually, because it's about the bottom line and what sells, present that more homogenous line of plants that you're saying we're trying to avoid. Here's these 5 plants that you can find in your garden for a low maintenance garden, and they're all wind pollinated because that's what's easy and low maintenance, and they're like yuccas and succulents that just sit there that don't actually provide much habitat at all. So oh my god, so that's really major. The plants that are provided don't need
creatures or animals to pollinate. That's depressing.
Yeah, it is. That's why I hate low maintenance gardens, because it often means that it's all wind pollinated plants that don't actually provide much habitat or leaf matter or flowers or anything.
Yeah, and it all keeps coming back to, my thing I've been saying to a lot of people lately is these worldly human woes actually often, they're not most of the time actually human, they're corporate problems, really, aren't they? That, you know, they're about the fact that the community has shifted to the individual, but I do think that it is commerce that has driven a lot of that and a lot of these decisions. And that's where, again, that's that if you think global and act local in another way, it's about supporting those small businesses, but then that's really hard when things are so differently priced. There's a lot to think about,
exactly.
Right?
It's hard, and it's hard for your everyday consumer to be able to do that. And people are like, oh, you just grow your own food. And it's like, you know how much it costs to set up a little garden to grow your own food? Like, people in South Auckland are struggling. They can't just grow all their own food. It's not that simple. Like, we need to have the initiatives in place, like Whenua Warrior, who's out there helping these smaller communities be able to grow their own food.
And how's that being done?
So that's run by someone called Kelly.
Yeah.
She's absolutely fabulous, and she goes out to these communities, and she gets grants to be able to then help those people be able to set up their gardens and help them become sustainable and help them work with the land, like the Māori way of kaitiakitanga and working directly with the land that's really being lost, and she's really pushing, helping people reconnect with that and reconnect with where their food comes from. All these things are so important.
Because, like I say, businesses have got in the way. Yeah. And have you heard of food deserts?
In what respect? Well, just so large areas without being able to grow food?
No, not grow. In terms of communities that the less money there is around, the more immediate decisions have to be made.
Exactly.
And with the food desert thing, that's the idea that not only would it not be easy to set up a garden, but in terms of your actual day-to-day purchased diet, there's whole areas that don't even have options for good food compared to better off areas now.
Oh, exactly.
Yeah, so...
Think of how many more takeaway places are in poorer communities.
Yeah, that's right.
They really target them. It's really sad.
What is the plan moving forward?
So, got big plans for this year. It's quite exciting. So we're getting registered as a charity at the moment. So that's our big plan. And then we'll do a big charity launch event. We're changing a lot of our branding and initial things like that to get everything set up and running properly. We have a whole board of people behind me now. It's not just me. I've got Rob Thomas, who used to be on the Waitemata local board, who's helping run the proposals. We've got Chris Firkins, who is a biodiversity expert from Auckland Council on our board. Just a whole array of different experts within their field that are now behind this making it happen. So it's not just me. And which is quite exciting.
Is that a lot of weight off your mind?
A lot, because now I have support. And I always had that support, but it was never really formalised in any sort of way. Whereas this is formalised now. It's like they're a part of this. This isn't just me. This is bigger than myself now.
Great.
And which means we can start launching some things. We've put together a great proposal to the Waitemata local board for their next round of funding to be able to finish off the Greyland pollinator path, which we want to be able to do in connection with Matariki, which is around June. And we also have some other bigger projects we want to get involved in. A lot of it isn't. We're putting together proposals for some bigger companies to be able to help them create better pollinator spaces, basically. A lot of stuff we can't quite release yet, but
I think,
a lot of things in the works.
I think, as I say, the organisations around us are human run and resourced at the end of the day, and I think people being told how to do things, like in an organisational sense, I think there's real worth in that. Like I was talking about before, this is like, how do we do things? Someone says this is what you can do, this will make our communities better. But
also working with them to figure it out as well. I find that if you just tell people what to do, they won't necessarily do that, but if you help them come to that conclusion themselves. Sorry,
that's actually what I was meaning, is like you're coming to them with a solution in terms of like what, you should do this. This is a problem, right?
Like they can come to a public park and we can help put pollinator-friendly vegetation there, and then you've got all of those follow-throughs that they can then go, oh wow, I can do the same thing in my own back garden. Maybe I could do it on my berm. Maybe I could look at what's happening in my local parks or my local school. Maybe I could work with the students, and then people start to get thinking. And the more people that are thinking about how we can get pollinator-friendly vegetation throughout Auckland, the better it can be, because when people come to me with their own ideas and initiatives, then I'm able to help them figure out how to do it. So we have a lot of people that are just like, my local park down the road, I really wish there was something there. Can you do something? And I'm like, well, I've got a lot of projects I need to do. Can you do something?
Here's a starter pack. Just read this and do that.
Yeah, I've been so tempted to release a starter pack.
It's not such a silly idea, some form of that.
Well, we've started writing some toolkits and guidelines. Once again, they're very time-consuming things to do, and there isn't necessarily a black and white way of doing things, which is why you hire landscape architects to design the public realm. It's actually a really complicated space to be dealing with because of all of the property boundaries and maintenance issues and all of those sorts of things. Just designing a place that feels good for people as well.
It's been extraordinary today how versed you are on every aspect of what I've asked about. Like sometimes even people who are really expert in their fields, there's sort of areas that are left to others in the group. So with all this information and with the group, as you say, with more support coming on board long term, I don't want to be telling you what to do after, as I say, you seem to have everything covered. But have you? It's all about communication of the message, right? Are you going to try and, how are you with the media and exposure end of things? Have you thought about having someone involved who's sort of the guru at getting coverage for a lot of what you're doing?
I'm actually really lucky that I've got a few marketing guru sorts of friends.
Perfect.
All the papers really love the initiative too, that I pretty much just need to put out a press release and they will generally publish it and talk to us. There's like people at the Ponsonby News who are just begging to do more stories again, and Herald and staff, they love it. It's been on Radio New Zealand, Whānau Living even.
I'm laughing at the press thing because the one I read today, it comes back to you and I talking about younger generations. It was someone older than you saying most young people are on drugs or this person is doing something valuable for the community. It was like this strange opening to this unnamed organisation's article, or whatever it takes. So just in closing, so forgetting the kind of literal knowledge and advocacy and research and all of that information you've imparted on me today, what has this project taught you? What has this taught you about the world around you? About
humanity.
Yeah.
Well, I often...
It's a very stonerish kind of existential question.
So I think one really key thing that it taught me along the way was I had this really sort of life-changing moment, and that was when we installed that very first pollinator park, because that for me was the cornerstone. Like, it was the thing that changed everything. It made it a real thing for me. And I thought, well, this may be a thing, but who's going to care? Will the community actually care? Will they actually want to look after this place? Will they even come to the event? Like, it was such a gamble. You run a community event and 50 people on Facebook say they're going to come, but will they come?
And then it rains. And
nobody's there. And I've definitely had a few of those sorts of maintenance events, and it's really hard to get people to maintain something compared to install something. But that first day where we put that park in, it's a small place. It's like 100 metres squared. We had over 100 people come to install this tiny little park, which is pretty much just like a few plants per person, and it was done within like half an hour, and it was like a 3-hour event. Thankfully we had music and face painting, people were able to talk, and I was able to educate them on what we were doing, so we had time for all that other fun stuff rather than just planting. But it made me realise that people actually do care.
That's a great thing to realise.
Because like, you do get to that point where you're just like, I sometimes feel like no one gives a shit anymore. We've just sort of got into that doom and gloom of, well, the world is so fucked now. Is there any point in doing anything? And even I get my days where I'm a little bit like that. But I think we need to instill this sense of hope that there is a chance, because if we don't, then we have no chance at all. Like, if everyone just gives up, then the world just flops.
So you've
Whereas
learned...
if enough of us try, then we've at least got a chance. It may not work, okay? It may be an entire waste of time, but we might as well try, right?
You've learned that given the means and the outlet that people are worried and concerned and they do care and that people do come together.
Because I want there to be able to be a future. Like, people of my generation are now starting to be like, should we have kids? Is that the right thing to do?
Is that really a thing? I've read about that.
Will they have a society to grow up in? I've had that thought constantly, and I really want to have kids one day. But I wouldn't want to bring them into a world that's crashing and burning. Like, how soon is this going to happen? Like, can we turn this around so that we do feel okay about bringing the next generation into the world?
I think that's probably a nice... holistic way to end in terms of the hope and the danger presented. I sort of if it were a film, I sort of thought it back to the cutesy thing. It's like a Pixar film with a whole lot of bugs, in a room. Glad that you came along.
So my boyfriend calls me the pollinator princess.
Yeah. You
like
got it.
Snow White with all of the animals and bees and stuff fluttering around.
By all means necessary, I say. No, yeah, look, thank you for your time. And I think what we're really in closing, because we talked about this on the phone or on email or wherever it was, is not only do I do this podcast because I want to talk to interesting people and let other people know about what they're doing, but there's a more probably pragmatic and practical thing here in terms of, how can people reach out and support you who hear this, who don't know about the initiative already, and we'll leave it there, okay?
Okay, so the main ways that you can support go to our website, which is www.pollinatorpaths.com. Sign up to our newsletter so you hear about stuff. Follow us on Facebook and Instagram, all those marketing places. Like the post, share the post, it gets the message out there. You can also donate if you're super lovely.
That's what I was going to ask about.
As soon as the charity's set up, so any minute now. And you can also volunteer. You can come to our event days. Potentially, if you are with a business, maybe you can give sponsorship of some sort. Maybe we could partner together if there's something that you want to do on your grounds. Or just any way you think of that you want to share your skills or support. We have people coming out of the woodwork with so many different things. A lot of people just say, how can I help? And rather than just going, come to a planting day, I go, well, what do you do? What are your skills? And people will be like, oh, well, I design websites. And you'll be like, great, you can help us design our website. Like, people being able to utilise their actual skill sets for the charity, I find is a lot more beneficial for both parties in a lot of ways.
Oh, fantastic. Thank you for your time.
And just get outside into your garden and plant things.
I've got to figure out my balcony. I mean, we've met once, but you are going to get photos of my balcony a year down the track. Just see how it's going.
Happy to help.
Verbal high straight down from up above.
All right, so regular listeners will know that I don't have an ending on this by design. It's just the last person says something, generally goodbye or thanks, and then we're off. Regular listeners will also know that I occasionally sprinkle the conversation with Easter eggs or narrative accompaniments. Some episodes I do, some episodes I don't. I did this episode, but I also think about composition, and I thought I'd already done enough of them. Didn't want to get too wacky. But I did want to go and listen to what the dulcimer was. And when I heard it, I was very familiar, as you will be in a second. It is American Folk 101. And then I went dulcimer deep, as one can and does with topics on the internet these days. And so the second piece you'll hear is a gentleman on a much more involved and sizable dulcimer than Andrea's dulcimer, which is, I believe, is called the hammered dulcimer. And the gentleman who's going to play it in the second piece is widely considered the Bella Fleck of the hammered dulcimer. At this point, I've got to say I know more about what a hammered dulcimer is than Bella Fleck. I probably should have Googled that. So the second piece, so the first piece is right in the pocket. It does what it does. It's very evocative, and as I say, you'll know that instrument, and it'll be evocative of a place and a time and a feel. The second piece is a Tears for Fears cover, which starts off great and quirky, but I was not happy with it near the end. I'll put the whole thing in. You can just stop whenever you want. You're a grown-up. Bye. So here's, just to clarify, here's traditional small piece of dulcimer in its correct environment, in its correct habitat, and then this sort of dulcimer wizard doing a Tears for Fears cover. Okay, goodbye. See you next time.